Yes Music Podcast, episode 141. Geoff Downes talks about heaven and earth.
Hi, this is Geoff Downes, and you're listening to Yes Music Podcast.
Welcome to episode 141 of the Yes Music Podcast, one fan's exploration of the world's greatest progressive rock band. I'm your host, Kevin Mulrine. Please remember, as always, how you can get involved with the podcast via the various different ways on the site, yesmusicpodcast.com. The fourth track from Heaven and Earth appeared in extract form on yesheavenandearth.com this week. I'm not going to talk about it this week for reasons which will become apparent in a moment. However, if you look at the bottom of the page at yesheavenandearth.com, you'll see that a new item has appeared. 4 rectangles of a grid displaying the album cover are presented, which turn into links to the 4 extracts when you hover over them. Does this mean that extracts from each track on the album will eventually fill up this grid? We'll have to wait and see. There have been a number of generally very negative pre-release reviews of Heaven and Earth this week, all of which have been released before the official embargo date of 4th of July. I'm going to include an examination of those in next week's episode, alongside my own thoughts about the album. I was very excited to receive an advance copy of Heaven and Earth from the publicity company this week. Am I now part of the official music media? It's starting to look that way, which is very exciting. In the meantime, I hope this week's episode will provide some useful background information on the new album and whet your appetite for the release. So it's taken me 141 episodes and almost 3 years, but as I'm sure you've guessed, I finally got to speak to one of the members of the band this week. It was a slightly surreal experience, but a huge treat to be able to ask some questions directly to Geoff Downes, who was in his home studio, I think. I was given just 15 minutes to speak to Geoff, who was, as you'll hear, extremely generous and forthcoming. I've been in communication with the Yes publicity company since I started the Yes Music Podcast back in August 2011, and I'd like to say thank you to Sharon for giving me this opportunity. I don't think it will be the last, which is very exciting. I'd also like to thank everyone who's listened to the podcast so far, and welcome those who are listening for the first time. Finally, particular thanks must go to everyone who wore a YMP t-shirt to a Yes concert recently, and or mentioned the YMP to the band at a meet and greet. I'm sure this is what made the difference between being chosen for an interview and being passed over. So it was a telephone interview, and I've had to do a bit of cleaning to make the level audible. But what's important is, of course, what Geoff actually says. I've included a full transcript of the interview with the show notes for this episode over at yesmusicpodcast.com. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Geoff Downes. I hope you enjoy it. Creating the new studio album, Heaven and Earth, seemed to be quite a complicated process, with Yes alumnus Billy Sherwood on mixing duties after Roy Thomas Baker did the production. Are you happy with the results?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, any album you do, you come away from and you don't really know what to make of it, and certainly, this one was no exception, really. But I think it's an interesting album in respect to the fact that, it's obviously the first one that John Davison's done, and I think in many ways we kind of let him run with the ball on it, and we all collaborated with him separately, and then we just started to put it all together. So it's an interesting process, certainly.
Well, I saw the Birmingham gig that you did on the 4th of May, which was fantastic. It was the most enjoyable concert I think I've ever attended. It was really, really brilliant. How much difference does knowing each other live make when you go into the studio?
I think it's a different process. I think that live, you've got that one thing on your mind for that particular day, and that, the gig for that particular night is the all-important thing that you actually have to address yourself towards. But, in terms of an album, it's very much a case of, experimentation and seeing what works, and, who comes up with the ideas. And it's, the live situation is very much a case of, making it as best you can, knowing the elements that you're dealing with. Yeah, so when you got into the studio, what was it like working with Roy Thomas Baker? It was really good. I mean, I really got on with him very well. I saw a lot of the guy that produced the first few Asia albums, Mike Stone, was his engineer for quite a few years, certainly all through the Queen period. So there was a lot of influences I could see that affected Mike when he was been working with him, certainly in ways that he recorded vocals, a certain methodology of the actual recording process was in some ways quite old school, but nonetheless quite refreshing. And I think that we we really kind of got, rallied to what he was trying to do.
Yeah, so, I mean, you've recorded many times with Steve Howe in Asia, and this is now your third album with Yes. What are the different ways that different bands approach a new album like Yes and Asia? Are there distinct differences?
I think not really. I think that, the songwriting is obviously the key part, because that's what everything hangs on. So I think you've got to have, the songs more or less in place rather than, sitting in the studio waiting to pick my inspiration. Particularly these days, it's a lot more, I think it's a lot more business-like than it used to be. I think that in the early days it would be a bit random. But I think the way that the recording process has gone, it's a lot more kind of organised now, and you can do quite elaborate preparations prior to going into the studio, which is really how we approached this album. But again, I think we did rehearse it as a band, so we got a feel for arrangement and parts in the music as well.
Okay, well, it's interesting that you say about preparing as much as you can before you get into the studio. And I noticed from the Wikipedia entry for the new album, which is already in existence, that the game was written by Chris Squire, John Davison, and Gerard Johnson. How did Gerard get involved with this?
I think it was an idea that Chris had been floating around for quite a while, and he was involved with The Sin a few years ago. They resurrected that for a little while, and I think Joe Johnson was involved with them at that point. So I think maybe that idea, I can't be sure, but I've got a feeling that idea might have been something that came out of that period, and then it was kind of reworked with John Davison.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. And you have a single writing credit on the album, according to Wikipedia, which is on the last track, Subway Walls. And I have listened to the album, and that one is one of my favourite tracks. It's got some great rhythms and textures in there. So can you say a bit about how that track came about, and also what you think of John Davison's writing, who was your co-writer on that?
Well, I think that we actually, when he came to stay with me for a week, we approached two pieces. One of them is actually longer than Subway Walls, and I think is probably... I think it's a nicer track in some ways, because it's very, very progressive, and it's got some big themes in it. But I think Subway Walls does encapsulate two sides. The John's side of his chorus writing and my instrumentation. I think that those two things come together pretty well in the song, and I think that I think we were conscious that Yes is not just about straightforward songs, and so I think we wanted to mix it up a bit on that one, and throw a few weird time signatures in there, and make it a bit more interesting. But certainly from my standpoint, the two pieces that we worked on were both big progressive rock pieces, and that was the only one that we did, which hopefully we'll be able to put the other one on, when we get when we do another album. But it's still there, and it's a very interesting piece nonetheless.
Well, that's very tantalising to tease us about that for the next album, I have to say. When you were approaching this album, how much of the musical legacy of the band were you consciously trying to make reference to or evoke in the new album, or do you think Yes should just constantly evolve and become new?
I think it's just an evolving thing, yes, and I think that it would be, one of the hallmarks of its longevity has been the fact that, it's survived numerous personnel changes and is constantly, it's a moving mass, if you like, and, I think that is one thing that has helped to sustain it as long as it has. But obviously I think that there is the legacy, and people like Steve Howe and Chris Squire, they can't help sounding like they do. So it's always going to have, some of the hallmarks of the early Yes stuff anyway. And certainly with Alan, and Alan was there pretty much, not from the beginning as well. So I think that they've sort of put their stamp on almost anything that they would do together. So it would have an inherent sound of Yes anyway. I think the fact that with John having a similar high tenor to John Anderson, that kind of, also makes it put in that area. And, Chris is very much in one of the hallmarks of Yes's sound in the past has been Chris's harmony vocals that he's put into a lot of the songs. So I think, whilst it still has the Yes tradition, we were conscious that we also wanted to move it forward a bit and throw in something different into the equation.
Yeah, and I think that's very much the case. It's quite a varied album, and I think it's a lot more varied than Fly From Here.
It's probably, the purists that's really only look at albums from the 70s or the Yes period in the 70s. They probably won't like it, but I don't think they'd probably like it anyway. Tend to be very kind of not blinkered in their vision, but they're very focused on that particular era. But I think if you look at Yes historically, you've seen so many different lineups and different genres. Certainly the 80s Yes was very different from the 70s Yes. With Trevor Rabin and Tony Kaye coming back in the fold. So it's been it's a very interesting band historically, and I think that this album is it's just another chapter in the book.
Absolutely. Well, some of the keyboard lines on some of the tracks in the new album felt to me like they had a little bit of a 1980s feel, and of course with your own personal legacy with the band from 1980, from Drama. Was that something that was deliberate?
Yeah, I think that, from my standpoint, Yes's keyboards sound work best when they're more in the vintage mould, and I think that tends to work best with Steve's guitar. The two instruments, at the forefront of a specific instrumental section. I think the vintage sounds tend to come through better, and certainly acoustic piano and Hammond organ, electric piano, some lead synth lines. These are the Moog type synth lines. These are all very much synonymous with Yes's early period, and we certainly took it, used those elements on the Drama album, but started to incorporate, new technology that was around at the time, which was samplers and things like that. So I try and mix it up a bit, I mix up the new with the old, I think.
Yeah, well, I think that does come through strongly in the album, and there are, for example, some great moments with Chris Squire's bass and your Hammond sound, really blending together nicely.
Yeah, and I think that's been, something that has worked with in Yes throughout the entire band. I mean, maybe the 80s Yes was not so focused on keyboards, and that was much more guitar driven. Certainly with Trevor Rabin's style of guitar playing. I think that was not so much a keyboard-driven period, but certainly if you go back to, say, Drama and before that, certainly Fragile, they're very much keyboard-orientated albums. Close to the Edge has got a lot of keyboard textures in there. So it's, I think it's an important ingredient to retain that, because I think that also gives it its signature sound.
Absolutely. And of course another signature of Yes is the album artwork, and I love the album artwork that's on there by Roger Dean, and you've had a long association with him, of course, through both Yes and Asia. How important do you think to an album is the cover?
I think it's still important. I think that Roger's been associated with Yes for many, many years, and certainly the signature logo is very much part of Roger Dean's background, I think, and it's important, I think, to show that it's not just the band that just puts just an average stamp on its cover, and that's it. We try and make it as interesting as possible, and Roger's very good at doing that and coming up with different designs. It makes for much more interesting merchandise and posters and that kind of thing that people can collect, rather than it just being something that's bland. So, and of course the significant thing is with a bit of a return to vinyl, when these things, these albums are released on vinyl, you really start to get that great feeling back about looking at a proper record sleeve.
Well, I'm looking forward to getting the vinyl copy and putting that up with my other Yes albums on my shelf here. Any idea which tracks from the new album might be given an airing on tour?
Well, I think we'll certainly have a look at probably Believe Again. This is the opening track on the album. That's possibly something we'll look at. Maybe either The Game or World of Our Own. Those two, probably either one of those two. It depends on time, really, because we're doing Close to the Edge and Fragile in their entirety, and we've got a support band, the band called Siddhartha from Canterbury.
Yes.
We're going to be doing the whole tour. So we've only really got 2 hours to get it all going. So I would think probably, in the middle of our set, we'll do a couple of the new songs.
That's great. Well, listen, Geoff, thanks so much for talking to me this afternoon. It's been fantastic to share some thoughts about the new album.
I've heard all Yes Music podcasts every week. I love to hear what Kevin says. I've heard all Yes Music podcasts every week. I love to hear what Kevin says.
So that's about it for this time. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with my early view of heaven and earth. In the meantime, please do get involved by subscribing to the podcast via your podcatcher or web service of choice. That's yesmusicpodcast.com. And do let me know if you can't find the YMP where you'd like to listen. I'll try and solve that problem. You can leave a comment on the blog, send a tweet or direct message to @yesmusicpodcast on Twitter. Send an email to show@yesmusicpodcast.com. You can upload an audio file or record a voice message via the buttons on the site. Or you can leave a voicemail on 0844 579 6949 using the mailbox number 39417. So until next week, just remember, whatever your progressive rock question, the answer is yes. Yes Music